The Stripe API evolves over time, and there are multiple API versions. What properties you see in responses, what parameters you're permitted to see in requests can change between API versions. Here's an API change log on the Stripe documentation site. Looking through it, you can see how the API has evolved over time. When you create a new account, Stripe sets your API version the first time you make an API request and keeps it at that version until you manually upgrade it, which you can do in your dashboard's account settings. You cannot, however, set your API to an older version of the API through the dashboard. Let's look at where you find your API version. Account settings, API keys. Remember, these API keys are just test ones. And right here would be your version. So the first time I make an API call, then it will turn to a drop down and let me upgrade it as they release new versions of the API. This link right here takes you straight to that upgrades guide that shows you a history, change log of the API. So that's very useful. So let's talk about how this corresponds to Stripe.net. Because the Stripe API is a moving target, and Stripe.net has a strong dependency on that API, each release of Stripe.net forces a version of the Stripe API for which it was designed. You can find out the latest version supported by viewing the Stripe configuration CS class under the infrastructure folder in the GitHub repository for Stripe.net. Let's take a look at how we might do that. So we dig into the source folder, then Stripe, then infrastructure, and find the Stripe configuration.cs class. We're in the master branch right now, so the latest release of Stripe. You can see here, this is the key line. The supported API version is currently set to 2.18.2015. Looking back through the API changelog, the development of Stripe.net is understandably often several versions behind the latest Stripe API version, since the new API has to first be released by Stripe, and then ongoing development must be done on Stripe.net to keep up with the changes. Switching back over to our view of the API version, if you need to find a version of Stripe.net that matches to a particular API version, you can simply go up here, switch over to tags, and switch to an earlier version and see which version of the API it supports. So we're on 3.02 there. If we go all the way back to, say, 3.0, you can see the API continues to go back in time. The Stripe API version in a given Stripe.net releases Stripe configuration file must match the Stripe API version under account settings on your dashboard. If these API versions do not match, you may experience errors. So why did I say may experience errors? To understand why, we will need to understand the internals of how Stripe.net forces the version of the Stripe API for which it was coded. Stripe.net overrides the API version shown in the Stripe dashboard by sending a Stripe-version header identifying the API version to use with all API calls. Because it works this way, you would never expect users to get errors related to incompatible versions of the Stripe API and Stripe.net. Unfortunately, one specific data structure, events, generated by Stripe API requests will always be structured according to the account API version set in your Stripe dashboard, even when using the Stripe version header. So Stripe.net's approach to forcing an API version with the Stripe version header works in lots of scenarios, including creating and charging customers, but when you start using Stripe.net with webhooks to read event objects, which we go over in the next module of the course, you can experience serialization and deserialization errors if the API version supported in the release of Stripe.net does not match the API version in your dashboard. For example, a deserialization error would occur when trying to take the JSON string from the Stripe API response and map it back onto the .NET object if the properties or data types on the object have changed between API versions. To be clear, the event object has a stable API and rarely changes, but the object that the event is about, a charge if it is a charge succeeded event, or refund if it is an event related to refunds, can change over time. It is also worth noting that reading an event object that is historical, happened in the past, will be a snapshot of when that event happened. Fortunately, in practice, reading historical event objects is not a common scenario. Again, we will go over Stripe events in great detail in the next module, and it will be easier to understand these edge cases. Is it worth using Stripe.net? I think it is. You just have to put the work in up front to get the correct versions. After that, every time you need to serialize or deserialize back and forth from JSON to .NET objects, that work will be done for you. So it's analogous to other choices you make on a project. Shortcuts are often not shortcuts over time. My suggestion is to start development on your project with the latest version of Stripe.net, so whatever's in master, and email Stripe support and ask them to set your API version to whatever that constant value is in the Stripe configuration class. Then you can make your own decisions about when you're ready to upgrade to new API versions and change it in your dropdown and deploy your code accordingly. Hello, I'm Craig McKeechee, and this is an excerpt from my Pluralsight course on Stripe Fundamentals with ASP.NET MVC. If you found this video helpful, be sure to check out the full course at pluralsight.com.